Rath. Everyone's favourite iconic feline alien with anger issues as big as Garfield's stomach. We all know Rath packs a mean punch and a meaner attitude, but what if I told you that he also has another secret ability that the show writers don't want you to know about? Want to learn more? Well, let me just remind you to like and subscribe, and without further ado, let's get right into it. It's hero time! So the scene that first sparked this theory is actually from Rath's debut episode all the way back in Ben 10 Alien Force, Khan of Rath. Fun fact, Rath's debut episode in the Ben 10 reboot is called Wrath of Khan, and I just kind of find it funny that they did it both ways. In the scene in question, Ben first transforms into Rath and freaks out because, well, that's what Rath does best, and Gwen puts his head in a bubble to calm him down. Rath goes on a rant until he suddenly stops and asks,
"Did I just use up all my air?"
and then comedically passes out right there. This scene is fine and dandy and all, but then, in this very same episode, Rath casually leaps out into space and boards an incursion ship without a spacesuit, even walking through a vacuum chamber that assumedly doesn't have any air in it either, because that's how vacuum chambers work. And he doesn't pass out from lack of oxygen, which would imply, at least to me, that Rath doesn't actually need air to survive. And no, it's not like he just held his breath during all that time, because we can literally hear him yelling as he goes around beating up all the incursion soldiers on board that ship. Also, yes, I'm aware that that should technically mean that he's not in a vacuum, because you're not supposed to be able to hear sound in space, but cartoons, including Ben 10, have put sounds in space all the time, so this can't really be used to justify the excuse that Rath was indeed in a closed area that was not being exposed to the vacuum of space. There is absolutely a vacuum inside that ship based on the fact that the incursions are all in zero gravity and the air gets sucked out the door to the captain's quarters when it opens. And Rath is still speaking as you can hear the air getting sucked out of that room, which would imply further that he doesn't really need air. This, like it or not, is an inconsistency, but let's give the benefit of the doubt. Since these two scenes are from the same episode, let's assume that this isn't actually a writing error, but perhaps instead another aspect of what makes Rath, Rath. So, are there any other episodes throughout Ben 10 where Rath displays a weakness to something in one scene, but an immunity to said thing in another? Are there enough examples to explain away this situation as something more interesting in universe than just a plot hole? Yes, actually. Multiple times throughout Ben 10's series, Rath displays a weakness to something in one scene, but a complete immunity to that same thing in another scene. Let's go over all of these moments, and then we'll bring them all together to discuss what this could potentially mean in relation to one another, okay? Alright, let's begin. We've already discussed Rath's oxygen inconsistency, so let's move on to Rath's relation with lasers. In one scene, Rath casually tanks multiple shots from the Forever Knight's laser lances without feeling pain, and in another scene, he bites through 7-7's laser sword without feeling pain either. But in a different scene, he goes out of his way not to get blasted by a Tekadon robot's lasers. Now, it goes without saying that these lasers obviously have various levels of power to them, like not every laser-based technology is going to have the same output, but it does strike me as odd that Rath can tank multiple shots from a weapon that can do this, but he feels the need to avoid laser attacks that can't even pierce a car roof. In fact, in this same scene, Rath actually does get hit by a laser, and he gets up like it was nothing despite it being a way bigger laser than any of the other ones we've seen him tank. So it calls into question even more why he felt the need to block these ones when he's had no issue casually facing lasers head on before. But anyway, next let's go over Rath's vulnerability to water. In one episode, Rath is so terrified of merely seeing water that he tried to get as far away from it as possible, and merely getting drops of water on his body was enough to make him incredibly uncomfortable. Yet in 2 other episodes, he's near or outright in water just fine. Then we have Rath and an inconsistency with his stamina. In multiple scenes, we see Rath performing feats of endurance running and sequences of advanced acrobatic maneuvers, and he's not even slightly winded. However, in this scene where he's having a foot race with Captain Nemesis, he is somehow not only slower than Captain Nemesis, but runs out of stamina in mere moments. Not really sure what to label this next one, but there's also the time Rath literally fell from the troposphere down to the ground below, which is about 7.5 miles or 12 kilometers above sea level, and he didn't even need so much as a moment to recover. And another time, we saw him completely whiff a landing on a bridge and crash down to the ground below without being phased. But in that same scene, a rock lands on his head which clearly hurts him. So there's some inconsistency with Rath not getting hurt by falling massive heights, but small falling objects can hurt him. This one isn't the most compelling example because these are different things, but the example is still there because they're relatively similar. They both involve gravity and momentum. Then there's an inconsistency in the episode where Rath got hypnotized. In one moment, he's uncomfortable with the fact he's being called Mr. Fluffykins, and then literally right afterwards, he says himself that he's called Mr. Fluffykins.
Get him, Mr. Fluffykins!
Let me tell you something, lady! Your wish is my command and all, but Rath is not entirely comfortable with being called Mr. Fluffy Kids. Who I am is Mr. Fluffy Kid.
This example is clearly done for the sake of a joke, but it will lend to our theory once we put it all together, so let's just continue on for now and hold on to that one. Next, there is the inconsistency of Rath and a weakness to acid. In one scene, he literally throws himself into the bowels of a pantophage and emerges unscathed, but in another scene, Acid Breath's acid hurts him. Now, I will say that obviously these are likely two different kinds of acid, so that could be the reason that they're different, but also in this scene, Rath isn't actually affected by the acid at first, which will lend more into our theory later, so again, hold on to that one. Then we have the time that Ben was called out for not knowing Spanish, which he did try to remedy with the Omnitrix's translation function, but to no avail. Yet later in that episode, Rath starts speaking Spanish fluently.
Déjame decirte algo, unicornio hipster.
This example is a little different from our other ones, but once again it will lend to the theory, so just bear with me. Another example from the same episode is Rath suddenly wearing clothing. After it was brought to Ben's attention in a previous episode that Apoplexians have a highly developed sense of shame and do wear clothes.
Are you wearing pants? Wait, time out. You wear clothes? Apoplexians wear pants?
Of course we wear pants. Let me tell you something, Ben Tennyson. Apoplexians have a highly advanced sense of shame.
So with that said, we now have 9 examples of inconsistent weaknesses or inconsistent character traits when it comes to Rath. There could be more that slipped under the radar, but these were the 9 that I caught while rewatching Rath's episodes. If you can find more, please comment them below, that would be great. Now, most people would either say that all of these are just down to bad writing, or it's all done for comedy relief so it doesn't mean anything. But since it's my job to overthink cartoons and try to draw more interesting and satisfying connections than what the truth likely is, what I see here is a pattern that indicates a unique ability that Rath has, which is never explicitly stated to us. I think that Rath has an ability that I will dub weakness impermanence, or in other words, the ability to be immune to things that he is not aware he is weak to, or that Rath convinces himself he isn't weak to. We know that Rath lacks at least some level of object permanence, based on the fact that he got completely absorbed in looking at a laser pointer once and completely forgot about everything else going on around him, as well as the fact that he once somehow got so absorbed in a casual phone call with Gwen that he didn't even notice 2 Forever Knights in all their loud clanky armor sneaking out of the hatch of a tank that was right in front of his face, and he also didn't notice them running away and screaming until the call was over. To some degree, Rath does clearly have a problem with remembering that things around him exist when he isn't looking at them, which could be down to his anger issues more than anything else, but it still applies. What if we take that known flaw of his and extend it outwards to all of these weird inconsistencies of his, and say that Rath isn't actually inconsistently written, but rather, he simply remembered he had a weakness, and thus said weakness suddenly affected him. Let's go back over all of these scenes with this new lens, and see if it makes them all make more sense. When Rath ran out of air and passed out, he literally asked if he had used up all of his air, and then fell unconscious the exact second after saying it. Later in the episode, he disregards needing a spacesuit to breathe and somehow is fine. He made himself aware of the fact he needed air, and then passed out, but ignored that fact later on and was immune. This one fits our theory. In this scene where he avoided being hurt by lasers despite having an immunity to lasers in 2 other scenes, he was shot by a laser moments before that didn't hurt him but could have potentially made him think about lasers and therefore made him vulnerable to them, which is why he decided to block the following laser attack despite being unfazed by the last one. Following that logic, this one fits our theory. Rath was scared of water in one scene because he saw it rushing towards him, but in another scene where he was already standing in water and was focused on something else, the water didn't faze him whatsoever. He wasn't thinking about the water and thus it didn't bother him. Another fit. Then stamina. Despite the numerous occasions where Rath has displayed high stamina and long endurance, he was tired out after a few mere moments of sprinting alongside Captain Nemesis, and was somehow slower than him. When we consider that Ben was trying to turn into Jet Ray, his fastest available alien at the time, only to mistransform into Rath, perhaps that made Rath aware that he wasn't very fast, and thus his stamina and speed were reduced from what they usually are. Once again, it fits the theory. Then there's the case of Rath somehow getting hurt by a chunk of debris hitting him on the head, despite being completely unharmed by a drop from the troposphere and from smashing into a bridge and then the ground below. Here he lands, looks around at all the rubble, and then a bit of rubble hits him on the head. Perhaps he was thinking about the rubble, since he's looking around at it, and then that meant he was vulnerable to attacks by blunt force, like the rubble that hits him on the head afterwards. If we follow the logic, it lends to the theory. When he was hypnotized and expressed that he didn't like being called Mr. Fluffykins, that could be because it was brought to his attention that he was being called that. When he says it himself moments later, it could well be because he stopped focusing on it and therefore didn't care anymore. It adds to our theory. For Rath's inconsistency with acid, he was angry that the pantophage had eaten the Tiffin prince and was clearly too focused on his anger to focus on all the stomach acid he would have had to wade through in order to retrieve the prince. So that would explain why later on, when Acid Breath's acid got up his nose and he intentionally smelt it, that's why it hurt him. Interestingly, Acid Breath's acid doesn't actually seem to work at first. but Rath does acknowledge that it's apparently burning him from the inside.
A mysterious green cloud of painful acidic gas that's eating away at Rath's nasal passages even as we speak!
So clearly, bringing attention to it made it worse. It fits our theory. When it comes to Rath speaking Spanish all of a sudden, it was made clear in the episode that Ben didn't know how to speak Spanish and tried to cheat using the Omnitrix's translation function, but it didn't work properly. Later on, suddenly Rath knows how to speak fluent Spanish. While this could be a malfunction from the Omnitrix since Ben had Skurd mess with the translator, that seems unlikely since Skurd messing with the translator made Ben speak incorrect Spanish, whereas Rath speaks it perfectly. More likely, if this theory of mine is correct, is that Rath just gained the ability to speak Spanish because it was raised to Ben's attention that he couldn't. And as we've discussed so far, Rath is sometimes capable of things and sometimes he isn't. The same goes for when Ben learned that Apoplexians are supposed to wear clothing. Later on, Rath manifested clothing, perhaps as a result of finding out that other Apoplexians wear clothing. Although there are episodes between that revelation and the episode where Rath actually got clothes for the first time, so that does poke a slight hole in it, and I'm not going to deny that. But all in all, I would say that my theory works quite well in trying to justify these 9 inconsistent aspects of Rath's character. And I have 2 more pieces of evidence to help push this theory. In one episode, a Llewellyn brandishes a tool designed specifically to hinder Apoplexians, and I want you to pay very close attention to the language he uses to describe it and what it does.
It unleashes a sonic signal that is rather deadly to Apoplexians.
Now, of course, there is a million ways to word the same sentence, but I do find these particular words to be interesting. First of all, I want to make clear why I think the use of the word signal is important. If we pull up the exact definition of a signal, we see the following. 1. A gesture, action, or sound that is used to convey information or instructions, typically by prearrangement between the parties concerned. 2. An electrical impulse or radio wave transmitted or received. 3. To convey information or instructions by means of a gesture, action, or sound. That is to say, a signal is specifically a sound made in order to provide an instruction. This guy doesn't say that he's just producing a sound frequency that Apoplexians find painful, he's saying he is creating a sonic signal that is deadly to Apoplexians. I think what this device could be doing is creating a signal in an Apoplexian's brain that forces them to think clearly, and therefore, if my theory is correct, would mean that an Apoplexian would become vulnerable to attacks from said thing that they are being forced to think about. Sort of like a device that prevents you from ignoring something, which is, if the theory is correct, how Apoplexians are so invulnerable to damage, they just ignore it. But now, last and certainly not least, a piece of evidence that I personally find really compelling is the time that Azmuth used the Omnitrix to fight Vilgax. Vilgax threw a huge rock at him, and instead of Azmuth turning into an alien that could have just phased through the rock like Big Chill, or an alien that could have just come out from underneath the rock unscathed like Goop, Azmuth chose Rath. The smartest mind in 3, possibly 5 galaxies of all the available Omnitrix aliens chose to transform into Rath when it came to surviving an incoming attack, despite seemingly better options being available. And I think that's significant. Perhaps Azmuth knew the ability of Apoplexians to be immune to attacks that they ignore, and so chose to turn into an Apoplexian to completely negate the damage and then rush in for an attack on Vilgax afterwards. It would make sense. Rath is very strong, very durable, you get a 2-for-1 deal there. A solid strategy that I can definitely imagine Azmuth coming up with, although there is the counterpoint that perhaps Azmuth is too smart, so he wouldn't be able to trick himself into making this ability work, but as I think we're all aware, people become just a little bit dumber when they become Apoplexians, so I don't know if this is really a valid counterpoint. But there you have it. That's all of my evidence for my theory that Rath actually has a secret power, that being the ability to ignore harm, either physical or mental, from sources that he isn't paying attention to, nor actively thinking about. Let me know your own thoughts and theories in the comments below, leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed, consider becoming a channel member to help support me like the lovely people on screen right now, share the video around so it does a little bit better in the algorithm, and with all of that said, I'll be seeing you all in the next video. Adios, fellow heroes.